Dear viewers, I remind you, you watch the broadcasting from online forum venue, the promotion 1520, even now on the venue forum had 4 discussion formats, and right now the agenda is being continued by the dialogue with visionaries participants. Alexander Gabuev, head of the Asian program of Moscow Carnegie Endowment, and also Yukon Huang, professor of the Tsinghua University, leading higher school of Chinese Republic, one with the great experience in Chinese economics and economics of post-Soviet space, and in a chance presence of the speaker on the venue will give opportunity to learn more about expert opinion, how in the future global economics will develop. It will be view from Asia on development of economy of European space. And I give the floor to Alexander Gabuev.
Thank you. Dear Yukon, welcome. It's afternoon in Russia. I'm very happy to see you. That's the usual Zoom routine. We're sort of used to it. And it's weird because under normal circumstances, you and I would meet twice or 3 times a year in Washington, D.C., somewhere in Beijing. And maybe I would be able to lure you into Moscow again. But this whole life is now in Zoom. So I feel that our life has changed a lot on personal level. What about your outlook on the world as a economist, and what about the outlook on China? How much did the whole COVID madness change China, and what are the kind of key trend lines that you see in the Chinese economy right now?
Let's begin with the global economy. Forecasts suggest that this year global GDP will be negative, maybe 4 or 5%. And the pattern is that the more connected you are to the global economy, the more you are a major economic power, the more likely you're going to suffer a recession. And if you actually are in some of the poor regions of the world, which are not so connected by trade and investment, growth will probably be stagnant. But it won't be as deep as the decline in the western part of the world. And you come back to China. China is different. It was the first to suffer from the pandemic. It's the first to come out of it. Its recovery could be described as V-shaped, probably the only economy who's having a V-shaped recovery. So last quarter, the third quarter, the growth was almost 5%. That follows a negative 6.8% in the first quarter. So the forecast for this year is that China's growth might be somewhere around 2% for the year 2020. This compares with, let's say, minus 4% for the US, and perhaps minus 8% for the Eurozone. So China is going to be different. It's going to be the only major economy that's probably going to have positive growth this year.
I talked to many senior officials here in Moscow, and I think that sometimes they cannot believe the numbers that China is posting. Although we all know that growth is there, our embassy tells us that you can more or less freely travel inside China and life is sort of back to normal. What's your explanation between the big discrepancy and the kind of collapse in GDP in disciplined countries like Germany? That China, despite all of this, despite the lockdown and despite huge impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has taken during the first quarter, is managing okay during the second and third quarter. Like the figures are really very, very good.
Well, from the perspective here in Washington, D.C., and I think it's probably similar in Europe, it's surprising the extent that China is able to recover so quickly. And the numbers of people who were infected, mortality rate is so much lower than it was being experienced elsewhere. I think the answer is its ability to institute what I would call draconian measures, lockdowns, isolation, everyone being told and forced to wear masks, to be able to trace the population and to survey where they've been, and to actually go to various places. You have to be classified as whether you are so-called free from the virus or infected by the virus. So these draconian measures are very specific to China. you have these repeated incidents, for example, in recent months, where medium to large-sized cities of, let's say, 7 to 10 million, that may be a sudden outburst of a few cases. And then within a week, they might test 9 million people and then isolate the people who are infected. So that's China, ability to actually clamp down seriously. And that, I think, doesn't occur. Here in the United States, in Washington, we're having a difficult time even persuading people to wear masks, and a difficult time to persuade people to keep the social distances. Now, what about China's growth statistics? There's a perennial discussion about whether its statistics are exaggerated, politically manipulated. And I would say that China's statistics over longer periods of time are reasonably accurate. But during downturns, upturns, that tends to be overemphasizes or skewed in the wrong direction. So, for example, when there is a sudden downturn, the official numbers tend to be a little bit higher than you would expect. But the reverse is actually true. When there's a rebound recovery, growth is probably higher than the official numbers would say. And that's because the GDP numbers are so much calibrated to reflect government budget intentions and doesn't capture exactly the cyclical secondary effects. So I would say that the current growth rebound is pretty robust and real. It's captured in things like sales figures. Sales are assuming 4 to 5%. Energy use, industrial production, exports. Exports, for example, surged by 13, 14% in the last quarter. Those are measurable. Those are concrete. There's likely to be a trade surplus this year of 2% of GDP. If you compare that with last year's 1%, then you can see that GDP growth this year, the trade will account for at least 1 full percentage points, and the rest is coming from industrial expansion, investment. What is lagging in China is growth in consumption. So household consumption is not rebounding as fast as it is in the United States or Western Europe. And that is because China does not have such strong social protection programs.
I'm very tempted to go into trade, but let's stay a little bit with the countering measures to tackle the crisis that have been adopted by the central government in May, or like rolled out in May during the session of the National People's Congress that was postponed from March, when it's usually held, to May. So what's in that anti-crisis package? We saw that the scale and the amount of money that the Chinese government was putting to combat the COVID-driven crisis was similar to, perhaps similar or slightly less, that is similar rescue package the Chinese government rolled out during the global credit crunch in the previous decade. But it's definitely smaller compared to GDP. So why was Beijing not trying to kind of cover the problem with money? Because it has tremendous international reserves on the balance sheet of the People's Bank.
China learned its lessons from the global financial crisis when it put out a huge amount of money, much of it through the banking system, led to 5 years, almost a decade of credit expansion, surging debt levels, largely in the state enterprise and local government sectors. The debt to GDP ratio today in China is close to 300%. If you include households, government, and enterprises. So China does not want to exacerbate potential financial risks. So this particular stimulus program over the last 5 or 6 months was what I say more cautious. It focused much more upon budgetary flows to local governments for infrastructure investment. Expansionary credit policies, but not overwhelming, not as much as it was during the global financial crisis. And this is likely to continue. Infrastructure investment has been rebounding. It's not surging, but it's solid, somewhere around 5%. Housing construction is rebounded, but also leveled off. So I don't think the government is going to stimulate infrastructure investment as much as it has in the past. The important thing that's affected China's growth is exports. And exports have surged much faster than people had expected. It began with the sales of medical supplies and equipment, largely to the West, the United States, Europe, other countries. It was then supplemented by demand for laptops, communications equipment, because households and businesses in the West are in isolation or lockdown. But this last quarter, what you see is a surge across a wide range of industrial products, household supplies, mechanical equipment, all sorts of product lines. And some of these products would normally have been produced and exported by other countries, but there are supply problems in other countries because of the pandemic, and China is now filling in the gap. So you now have what I call a growth rebound, which is very much driven by exports, not so much by investment or consumption in China.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I remember that during the first quarter when the pandemic has kind of started to unravel Chinese growth, and like it was still very much concentrated in China, I talked to many Russian industrialists who sourced a lot of their spare parts and different parts of the tools and machinery in China. And it was very interesting how much the global production is depending on China, and depending in particular on Hubei province and Wuhan. Because people were in microelectronics business, when I told them that the lockdown will be severe in Wuhan and Hubei, but it's kind of easing in different parts of China, they were kind of panicking and saying, oh, we are finished, because 90% of the stuff that we need is produced only in Hubei province. So that's the end of the business. And then like Hubei went out of lockdown, so they were relaxed. But I remember that it was a lot of concern during the first quarter that this dependency of the global economy in value chains on many production platforms in China are making it vulnerable. And there was a lot of talk among big businesses, including some Russian companies, that the supply chain should be diversified away from China. So now what I hear from you is that China showed that it's much more robust because it can put in these draconian measures, overcome the pandemic faster, and remain a strong growing engine in terms of simple manufacturing. Is that correct understanding?
No, I think that's basically the storyline of what's been happening over the last 8 or 9 months. You're absolutely correct. In January, February, March, Wuhan shut down, and the world realized that it was a center of a lot of parts and components that were needed in industry, communications, manufacturing. So that was a major blow, and it reinforced the general sentiment that most countries needed to be more self-sufficient in critical parts. And now with the pandemic, even in medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, ventilators, masks, rubber gloves. So you begin with what I call the pressures from the U.S.-China trade war a year, 2 years ago, where the West is basically saying we should be less dependent on China for manufacturing goods, for high-tech products. Supply chains should be restructured to reduce the dependency on China. Then in the beginning of the pandemic, that theme was reinforced by perceptions that excessive dependence on China for pandemic-related supplies was also risky. But today, it's starting to turn around because China's ability to ratchet up production is not available in other countries. If you look at places like Vietnam, it just doesn't have the scale. It can't produce the volumes being demanded. If you look at India, which does have this scale, but it doesn't have what I call the ecosystem to support a surge in manufacturing production. Its infrastructure is very, very weak. Its labor force is not as regulated or controlled as it is in China. And then you have this network of secondary suppliers, and these are critical. They produce the smaller parts, the packaging, the small engines and motors that are needed, all sorts of things which in other countries are difficult to get. It's easily available in China. So if you want to ratchet up productions of manufactured products which involve multiple components and parts, it's actually almost impossible to find another country that has the capacity that China has. And so today what you see is China's share of global trade soaring, 20, 30, 40% increase. And it's incredible because over the last 10 years, China's share of global trade is slowly declining. So all of a sudden during this pandemic, it's rebounding dramatically. And part of it is other countries are being affected by supply disruptions related to the pandemic, and they're unable actually to gear up production. So China's capacity is now probably 100%. In the West, we believe that productive capacity is somewhere around 80, 90%. In some of the other middle income countries in Asia, it probably is more like 80%.
How durable will this trend be? Because before the pandemic, I hear a lot of talk about Chinese labor becoming increasingly expensive, Chinese environment for foreign investors becoming somewhat tighter depending on the sector, and then the energy because of LNG revolution, because of shale gas revolution in the US becoming cheaper, and then there is automation. So there was a lot of talk that kind of basic manufacturing and then up in the value chain, like more sophisticated manufacturing will move out of China to also to newer markets. And like India was mentioned, Southeast Asia was mentioned, but also bringing back manufacturing to the US was also kind of trend line. Do you see this still as valid, or China has proven that that's basically kind of still the core industrial engine of the global economy and it will remain so?
Well, the movement of what I call labor-intensive production, simple labor-intensive production, out of China has actually been going on for almost a decade. So you see textiles and clothing, some simple and other products moving to Southeast Asia or to India or Bangladesh or Latin America. And that has been going on and it will continue. Because as you mentioned, China's wages are now about 7 times what they were 15 years ago. So China's wages today are maybe 2 or 3 times what they are in other so-called lower middle income economies in Asia or in Africa. But its labor is so much more productive and skilled. China is also mechanized and automated. The labor costs are becoming less important. It's the efficiency of the surrounding support for manufacturing which is actually making the difference, your ability to gear up. So when Apple comes out with a new model with iPhone, you can't find any other country where you can ratchet up 100,000, 200,000 workers and basically turn out the new product within a matter of a month or two. And this is the camera, the components, the chips, put it all in there, the packaging, everything, the glass, almost impossible to have this scale. You can't replicate aspects of this at a smaller scale to serve local markets elsewhere. And that, I think, is a key issue. If you are a middle-sized country, putting production in your country out of China doesn't make much sense. But it makes some sense to put it in India if you want to serve an Indian market. It may make sense if you want to serve U.S. and U.S. has these protective tariffs. In that case, if what you're producing is really designed for America, there's now, of course, less incentive to produce in China. But it's an interesting feature that Chinese companies are now actually investing in other countries, for example, to serve the U.S. market. So China's investment in Mexico has soared. China's investment in Vietnam to serve other Asian economies and the United States has also increased. So you now have an interesting issue that whereas there are companies pulling out of China, it's also true that Chinese companies are relocating part of their capacity elsewhere to get around these kinds of tariffs and restrictions.
Can we switch back for a moment to China proper? Because it's interesting what you say that the ecosystem around the production is just unparalleled, and there is hardly any place in the world that can match this. How much this new program of new so-called new infrastructure, which looks like the backbone of the new 5-year plan that's going to be discussed next week in Beijing during the plenum and then probably approved next March. How much does that fit in? Because I heard a description from a senior Russian official who said it looks like Chinese are very strategic and they used the previous crisis in order to build all kind of the basic infrastructure of the 20th century, all the roads, all the bridges, and all the electricity grids and stuff that's completed because of the 2008-2009 global credit crunch. And now they're using COVID to build all the infrastructure for the 21st century. High power electricity grids, big data centers, chargers for electric vehicles, like everything that the World Economic Forum in Davos describes as part of the fourth industrial revolution. Does it resonate with you? Is some currency to that argument?
Well, I would say that the picture is rather mixed, and it depends upon the type of activity. China came out of the global financial crisis much stronger than people expected. It came out of the Asian financial crisis back in the year 2000, increasing its share of global production. And other countries in Asia actually fell back. So there is this pattern that during crises or financial risks, periods of financial risks and supply bottlenecks, China is able to gear up and actually improve its standing relative to other countries. So that's happening. I think this is going to create some problems in terms of accentuating tensions with the West. In the new 5-year plan, I think there's basically two themes. One is the so-called dual circulation strategy that President Xi has emphasized, talking about improving the connectivity between the domestic activity and the external. And because the external environment is getting more negative, relying more on domestic demand. Now, some people have interpreted this to mean promoting consumption. And here I think it's actually misleading. Domestic demand is either consumption, but it's actually more domestic investment. Growth is not driven by consumption. It comes from growth. Only investment and productivity drives growth. So China is emphasizing how can it increase the quality of investment and therefore growth in the coming years. And that's the focus of the dual circulation strategy. And it's talking about use of the internet and technology to improve productivity. China's growth rate today has been running, aside from the pandemic, closer to around 6%. It used to be 10%. So the productivity investment has been declining slowly over the last 10 years. Investment rates have remained very high, around 43 to 45% of GDP. But because the rate of return on investments has been declining, growth is declining. So the challenge in this 14th 5-year plan period is reversing this decline in productivity. And I would say that there is probably two major areas that China needs to focus on. One is the inefficiencies of its state enterprises. Rates of return in the state enterprises is about half of what that is in the private sector. So that's one area. The other area is to improve the efficiency and quality of state investments in infrastructure relating to urbanization. China tends to spread its infrastructure around, partly for equity reasons, partly actually for security reasons in the far west. But that infrastructure investment is getting very low returns. So China has to deal with this kind of productivity issue in the 14th 5-year plan in order to maintain very rapid growth. And lastly, there's this heavy focus on innovation. And the question is, can China really be competitive? Can it become a major power in the next 20 or 30 years? And I would differentiate between China's ability to innovate in areas like consumer products, particularly internet services. It's first rate. So it's companies like Alibaba, Tencent, globally competitive. But in science-based, engineering-based innovation, the picture is more mixed. China, for example, can produce a quality high-speed rail, but it cannot produce a globally competitive car. And although Huawei can produce world-class communications equipment, China does not have the capacity to produce these semiconductors and chips. So that has become the vulnerability for China. So as everyone realizes, America is restricting the sales of chips and the ability to produce chips for affecting China in a very negative way. And I think that's a vulnerability and risk in the coming decade.
How much the whole kind of trade war issue is really a risk for the Chinese economy going forward? Like the exports have rebounded because of exports of masks and medical supplies and ventilators. But how much the tariffs that are now being imposed, and then all of the kind of unannounced side story, which is the tech restrictions and the gradual effort of the FBI and DOJ to push out Chinese scholars working for exactly engineering, IT, getting their PhDs in places like MIT or Stanford, how much that affects the ability of China to overcome the challenge that you are talking about, and how much the Chinese leadership is aware of that, and what is kind of the counter strategy?
I think you're absolutely correct to key in on the risks that is being caused by the decoupling, and particularly the risks associated in terms of the restrictions coming from the United States and also from Western Europe in terms of the transfer of technology and knowledge to China. I mean, China's growth rate of 10% for 3 decades largely is a consequence of its ability to transfer and make use of technology and know-how developed in the West and to introduce it into its domestic productive system. And it's extraordinarily successful in that regard. And we have to recognize this is a country with a per capita GDP of only $10,000 compared to 50, 60 in the West. So it is being more innovative or sophisticated in production at a rate much higher than one would expect for its income level. So this decoupling is a major threat. So not only is it availability of chips, but it's cutting off research collaboration, access to a wide range of data and sources that normally China would be able to use, and I think this has a major impact. Trade by itself, in a strict accounting sense, does not explain much of China's growth over the past several decades. It never accounted for more than 10 to 20% of its growth rate. In other words, no more than 1 or 2%. The rest essentially was investment and productivity increases. And the productivity increases came from moving relatively low productive workers from rural areas to urban areas. So you have 304 million Chinese workers coming from rural areas to the major urban centers. So that's China's growth story, investment, productivity, supported by trade in the sense of bringing knowledge to China. So who's going to suffer more from the decoupling and the trade war and these tariffs? A study done by the IMF a year ago suggested that in the short term, the next couple of years, China would be more adversely affected because it's more trade dependent than the US. But by breaking off this transfer of knowledge, actually, America was going to actually suffer more than China in the medium term. And why is that? Suppose America stops American companies from selling chips and high-tech equipment to China. So you have major innovative companies, Qualcomm, Intel, these companies, they derive 30 to 60% of their revenue from sales to China. Their ability, therefore, to generate profits for investment are severely damaged. And then if you look at the U.S. economy, it grows largely from innovation. It isn't a basic industries kind of production or labor-intensive production. It grows because of innovation and productivity increases. So if you damage America's ability to innovate, you potentially cut its future growth rate from, say, 2.5% or 2% down to 1 to 1.5%. So here is the likely scenario 5 years down the line if decoupling occurs. You find that America's growth falls from 2% to 1%. And 1% is a big problem, I think, in the United States in terms of employment expectations. So China's growth is 6%. It suffers. So it may fall from, let's say, 6% to 4%, a 2% loss. But 4% is still manageable in some ways compared to what it needs. After all, population growth in China is essentially zero. So per capita terms, it's still very, very strong. So China doesn't grow at 6 or 7. It grows more like 4. And it needs to find ways to maintain productivity. And that's why it's investing in producing chips, trying to get ahead in high-tech industries, but that's very expensive. So it's pouring money into these activities. In the short term, that money going into these high-tech activities generates a very low return because there's a lot of waste. You don't know if you're going to be successful. So this effort to be more innovative doesn't actually help near-term growth. It actually makes it harder. But the big issue is, what about 4 or 5 years down the line? We'll try to be more globally competitive in these high-tech areas. And I think this is, of course, is the big question. If you go back 5 to 10 years ago, most people would say, well, China cannot innovate. Its political system, its control on data, its restrictions, the inability to exchange information, retard or make innovation difficult. But China has been extraordinarily innovative over the last 5 years. So you have these companies, particularly in the internet sector, whose capacities and abilities are actually above that in the West. And so I still think there are areas where it's surprisingly good. There are areas where it still needs to catch up, and it's certainly trying to do so.
What about the kind of strategies on the corporate level, particularly we are talking those global tech companies? What I'm hearing is that some companies are thinking about creating an ecosystem or a platform that would operate in the West, centered around the United States, Europe, Japan, and then there will be a parallel ecosystem that will help them to sell their products in China and in countries friendly with China. So basically, they are prepared to the global economic Cold War, like two big blocks, and they want to operate in both, creating different legal entities and like structuring the profit centers the way that they can fuse money, revenues coming from both markets. But like, is it that way, or there will be companies that will have to choose their market and source of talents?
You point out a very interesting possibility that the restrictions in the West against Chinese companies may force a different kinds of corporate structures or relationships in order for Chinese companies to be able to survive in the United States or Western Europe. The TikTok case is a primary example. So now you have a situation where TikTok is being asked to essentially sell out its market in the U.S. to U.S. companies and to transfer its algorithms and know-how in order to be able to maintain a presence. And the question is, in this new kind of corporate structure, what will be the share or authority of the original Chinese company ByteDance? We don't know that yet, so I think this is a huge issue. Huawei, I think, is another clear example. Huawei is losing out in Europe and elsewhere in terms of its ability to move forward with construction of 5G communications systems. But is there a possibility that Huawei can actually partner with Ericsson or Nokia or with a U.S. company to provide assurances to Western governments that security concerns can now be handled in terms of a collaborative arrangement? Or even if you go further, in a situation where many products have dual use, both a commercial use and a security implication or risk, I think we need global agreements on how to regulate, ensure that these kinds of activities can be handled without creating the kind of suspicions and tensions which currently exist. So we're now treading into a new area, whether we find global arrangements as well as corporate structures that basically partner interests across countries to deal with these tensions that have become overwhelming in some ways.
What about American or global companies working in China? Because we see that the Chinese government is also tightening the environment and creating some tools that can sort of replicate the instruments that the US has. So China is not running a global currency, so it's not built as efficient sanctions as the Treasury operates because of the global domination of US dollar. But you look this negative list of the enterprises that was rolled out by MOFCOM, and the export control regulations, and you see that China is also creating a legal framework that can help it to put pressure on Western companies operating in China or depending on the Chinese market as well?
I think this is going to be a source of negotiation in the coming years. And I think the TikTok case is a good example. Suppose America says to China and Chinese companies, you're coming into an area where data sensitivity is an issue. And for you to come in, I want you to be willing to negotiate a collaborative arrangement with an American company to guarantee the security of data use. That's a condition. Now, China is basically saying this is unfair. This outright robbery of knowledge or technology developed in China. But of course, the reverse is true. China has been for decades restricting the access of foreign companies to the Chinese market in internet services and digital and areas where data use is sensitive or where censorship is a major concern. So an Amazon or a Google or a Facebook, the inability to operate in China is, in my view, a big issue. So I think this kind of conflict, which you highlighted, is going to elevate the discussion of the principle of reciprocity, equal treatment in the two countries. So China, if you want to expand into the West, you must liberalize and allow more foreigners to operate in sensitive industries in China. Now, to some extent, or to a fairly significant extent, I think the time is actually ripe for addressing this concern. If you go back 20 years, 75, 80% of foreign investment going into China required a Chinese joint venture partner. And that was to carefully monitor security risks, potentially, but largely to try to facilitate the transfer of foreign technology to China. Today, only about 20% of foreign investment in China comes under joint ventures. And in major industrial product lines, the barrier has been broken. So Tesla is the first Western car company that is now operating in China without a joint venture. German chemical company, BASF, is the first Western company in chemical industries to operate in China without a joint venture. So for what I call the mainstream industrial activities, China can easily say, I no longer require foreign companies to form a joint venture for entry. But you still have what I call the security activities, the data sensitive activities, the internet activities. China 10 years, 15 years ago was actually concerned that Western companies, particularly American companies, if they're allowed to operate, there would be no domestic competitors capable of competing with them. And that's actually a concern being felt in Western Europe. They now see that American companies dominate the market in these areas. There's no competition. Even in the United States, there's a worry about monopoly competition. So I think that this particular issue, which is now a concern not just in China, but globally, will be a opening for China, for the West to talk to China about. You need to open up the market in these areas where there's practically no Western presence, and we have to talk about joint regulatory partnerships to deal with these kinds of concerns. Otherwise, you're going to be locked out or not allowed to operate in the West. So I think this is, in fact, the big issue in terms of global collaboration or security, balancing security concerns with commercial objectives, which is being triggered by what's been going on in the pandemic and the trade war.
In the concluding part of the conversation, I want to talk more about physical connectivity and logistics centered around China and affected definitely by the pandemic and by the trade war and related issues between the United States and China and changing nature of relationship between China and European Union. I think recently one of the buzzwords of Chinese political slang was Belt and Road Initiative. And that was pretty visible here in Russia, for example. We didn't see that much of free trade agreements coming because we have a Eurasian Economic Union and we do a docking with China, but it's not about real free trade and reducing tariffs. We've seen some Chinese investment coming along Belt and Road, particularly into LNG projects on Yamal, and then there is a petrochemical company. But what we've seen is a huge uptick of cargo going from Western China to Europe using Russian railways and then our partners in Kazakhstan and Belarus as one of the vehicles. So the number of cargo and trains is going up, and then the cost is going down. So that's been the constant trend because the trade between Europe and China amounted to 1 billion euros a day. And like part of it could be put on a cargo, although maritime route is still inexpensive and competitive. And then there is many new items, in particular food and agriculture, that Russia and countries in between put on the trains and sent to the Chinese market. So what's happening to Belt and Road Initiative right now because of COVID, and how much important it remains in the next 5 years down the road?
Well, COVID has a dual effect. The need to isolate disruption of production and deal with the pandemic means that you can't proceed with what I call normal economic commercial activity. So that's on hold. Secondly, economies affected seriously by the pandemic are suffering from a severe recession, and that recession may be could last a year or two. So the Belt and Road is being slowed down by that. But the Belt and Road is being slowed down more broadly because of the lessons that China learned from the concerns and problems that were experienced when it was launched. There's too many examples of projects which didn't make much sense, of countries which cannot service the debt, concerns about the China's strategic intentions and whether those override any potential economic commercial benefits from the recipient countries. China began this process several years ago with the view that these kinds of risks, these problems, these concerns, that was should be the concern of the recipient. If they wanted the project, the risk was theirs. They didn't realize that if something went wrong, they would share in the blame. So now they realize there's a fallout. There is a political risk from bad deals. Secondly, China's financial situation is not as strong as it was several years ago. It still has $3 trillion of reserves. But nevertheless, its debt levels are much higher. These Belt and Road projects are financed by loans. These loans, in some cases, are going to be restructured. In some cases, they have to be written off. So there are financial consequences to the Belt and Road investments, which are now being weighed by Beijing officials. But the Belt and Road will be coming out and continued. So people talk about a Belt and Road 2. You're going to have better project selection, more concern about the financial implications, more focus on financial and commercial, and taking into consideration political risks. There is I think, a very a strong logical reason for the Belt and Road in terms of connectivity. Countries along the Belt and Road route, Russia, Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, reaching all the way out to Europe, that makes sense. The more that you can lower transport costs and improve security, the better that all countries along the route will be. But to realize the major benefits, you're going to have what I call a more robust global economy. You're not going to see that for at least a year or two, but eventually, hopefully, it will be the case. The issue becomes probably more important for Europe than it is for the United States. Europe is much more heavily invested in China than the U.S. And the reason is that Europe is much more of an industrial manufacturing center compared to U.S. companies who are largely focused in finance and services. So if you look at the structure of production in China, Europe's value-added contributions to manufacturing is about 2 to 3 times that of the U.S., the whole EU as a group. Europe is much more connected via trade now, increasingly so, with China than America. So I think the Belt and Road Initiative is reinforcing a natural increasing links between Europe and Asia, and the countries like Russia and the Central Asia republics. They are part of that chain. So overall, I think the concept actually makes sense, but it has to be done much more prudently and in a smarter way.
What about, and that's probably one of the final questions, how do you see a role of Russia in the changing environment for China? I think that there is a traditional role as an exporter of raw materials, and we see some major projects and major deals being concluded. China is pretty diversified in terms of sources of hydrocarbons, but I think it looks at Russia as one of the cheap opportunities in the neighborhood. And also talking to some people which have more security background, they tend to think that ground-based pipelines between two nuclear superpowers are safer for them going forward than maritime routes going through places like South China Sea or Taiwan Strait. But there is also another dimension, which is the agricultural exports, because China has done tremendous efforts in order to feed its giant population. It's done a lot of kind of very successful steps. There is new political campaign run by Xi Jinping to stop food waste, but still China needs to import more. And then there is natural compatibility with Russia. But third, what I see and what I hear from both Chinese colleagues and Russia colleagues, that exactly for the reasons of decoupling, China is in search for partners in fundamental research, mathematics, IT, developing algorithms, and they have highly skilled and highly trained mathematicians and engineers which have Stanford, MIT degrees in China and have terrific degrees from Tsinghua, a familiar university to both of us. But still, they want some foreign brains in the mix, and they believe that Russia, as a friendly country which still has some expertise, or at least pockets of expertise in those domains, can be a valuable partner for them.
I think you've outlined it quite well. The ongoing trade war, the technology battle, the tensions between China and the West makes it natural and understandable that China's relations would strengthen. There is, as you noted, complementarity in terms of the economic structure. So Russia's commodities, energy, potential agricultural possibilities merge well with China's needs. And I think that kind of trade and connectivity is quite helpful. China also sees that a strong, substantial Russian presence in the land routes connecting Asia to Europe is also vital to its own interests. I think there is a synergy in both in terms of economics as well as political security. But you well know that there are also perceptions, concerns in terms of this relationship on both sides that makes this kind of what I call forced alliance a little bit more softer than it might normally be. I think that as long as the tensions with the West remain as harsh as they are, I think the natural forces pushing the two together will increase. A cutoff in terms of education technology exchange between America and China will have a very severe impact. The U.S.-China research collaboration is the most substantial collaboration between foreign countries in the world. So if you break it apart, then you have what I call a gap, and China is going to be seeking potential other partners. China does not have too many allies, neither does Russia. So I see that this is going to actually also push the two countries closer together.
very final question. If you sit in Beijing, what are the three risks to the global economy that are key to you, and what are the three opportunities in the global economy that make you optimistic?
Well, when I look at it from a China side, I always say to others, China is actually hostage to a rules-based global system. That's its vulnerability. It's been the major beneficiary of the international financial trade system after it joined WTO. So it is now the largest trading partner with 124 countries. It's the second largest destination for investment. It needs a stable and well-functioning global international ecosystem to survive. So the decoupling risk, the weakening of institutions like WTO, WHO, is a real problem for China. And I think from a Western perspective, if they realize that China is actually hostage to a rules-based system, the potential to deal with China lies in saying to China, if you want a rules-based system that plays fairly and that is being supported by everyone, you need to change your behavior in certain areas. You need to reform and liberalize. You need to think about the role of your state sector and how that creates problems and distortions for the West. And if you're willing to adjust and accommodate changes which need to be reflected in the global financial system, then we can continue with a rules-based system. Otherwise, you have this problem of America trying to go it alone and Europe increasingly being drawn into having to choose between the two sides and also generating certain suspicions. In China, the risks for China, aside from this problem, the risks in China is how it can continue to basically manage a rising private sector, particularly in digital, internet, and other kinds of services, while maintaining what Beijing wants, which is strong authoritarian control. So you have this clash between the role of the market, which when she came into authority said should be dominant, with the principle that the state should continue to play the strongest role in the economy. Just a clash of these two kinds of areas. And I think the third issue from a China perspective that is, I think, increasing concern, it's increasingly resorted to what I call unilateral coercive policies through trade barriers, restrictions on the flow of tourists, or banning investments or products from coming in, whether it's in Germany or Norway or Korea with the missiles, or Australia now. It is also beginning to what I call threaten the viability of this rules-based global system. So the great irony today is that what I call the rules-based global system, its viability is being threatened both by the creator, for example, the United States, as well as the major beneficiary. And I think that the challenge is how do you preserve the best elements of this system? And for that, I think it's a role that Europe has to play, but has not been able to play so far because it's been so, what I call, disorganized and pulled in many directions.
Thank you so much. It's always an intellectual delight to talk to you. I hope that life will get back to normal, fingers crossed, sooner rather than later. We are all vaccinated with the Russian or American or Chinese vaccine, whatever that will work, and we can travel and see each other again. Thank you so much, Yukon.
Thank you. Very much appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you very much for listening.
«21 век перекроил и ускорил все сферы производства товаров, создавая новые предприятия, порой находящиеся в разных уголках земного шара. Нужный рынку товар необходимо доставить точно в срок, в целости и сохранности. Для организации перевозки любого груза требуется согласованное взаимодействие всех участвующих в ней сторон. Это взаимодействие предполагает формирование оптимальной логистической цепочки поэтапных операций для осуществления процесса транспортировки. Акционерное общество РЖД «Логистика», крупнейший в России и странах Балтии, мультимодальный оператор, отвечает за логистическое направление бизнеса холдинга «Российские железные дороги». Имеет 11 филиалов, 23 обособленных подразделения, дочерние общества и совместные предприятия за рубежом. Компания является членом Ассоциации российских экспедиторов, Международной федерации экспедиторских ассоциаций, ФИАТа и Ассоциации объединения генеральных подрядчиков в строительстве. Входит в Российский союз промышленников и предпринимателей и в Международный координационный совет по трансевразийским перевозкам. За десятилетнее существование более 6,5 тысяч отправленных поездов. Свыше 530 тысяч перевезенных ДФЭ грузов. Более 300 миллионов тонн обработанных грузов. 1 миллион раз наши грузы пересекали границу РФ. Больше 24 тысяч привлеченных клиентов. Маршрутная сеть охватывает более 30 тысяч городов. 18% на рынке 3PL и 4PL услуг. 172 миллиарда рублей выручки. Аутсорсинг более 100 предприятий. Более 1 миллиарда рублей экономии для своих клиентов. Транспортно-логистические услуги РЖД «Логистика» востребованы клиентами во всех уголках Евразийского континента. Мы предлагаем грузоотправителям широкий спектр услуг. От организации мультимодальных логистических сервисов, контейнерных перевозок, ответственного хранения грузов до строительства, модернизации транспортной инфраструктуры предприятия и обеспечения комплексной логистики предприятия. РЖД «Логистика». Движение, развитие, опыт.